This lesson, we are going to be creating an endpoint using Google Sheet data, and this is going to be output within a JSON format that we can then connect to from our web application and output it within our web page. And this is all done with JavaScript, connecting to making a fetch request to the web app URL that's got all of the JSON data. And this is live data that's sitting within the spreadsheet. So any updates to the spreadsheet, whenever the new request is made, that's going to also update the content that's being output onto the page. And this information is coming directly from the spreadsheet as we're making the requests to the spreadsheet data. AppScript is used in order to create the JSON output of the data from the spreadsheet. Let's go ahead and we're going to create a web app, and the web app is going to output some JSON data, and then we're going to grab some data from the spreadsheet and output that into the web app. So first off, let's go ahead and we're going to create an object that we can use, and this is going to be an object that we can use in order to output the JSON data. So there's going to be an array of objects, and they're going to be comma separated. So creating the structure for the first object, and it'll just be a string with my first name. The second item in the object is going to be my last name, and then we'll have one last item within the object, and that can have an ID. And we'll comma separate it out so we have multiple items within the object. And I'll make a quick update to the values for these ones so that the values are both going to be different as we're outputting it. And using the logger log, let's take a look at what we have currently for the object. So the object output is within an object format. Select the doGet function, and this is also what runs automatically whenever the web page loads. So we're also going to be returning back the object details. So run it, and there's our object content. And in order to output it, we can return it using the content service. And the content service allows us to create output that we want to output into the page. So we're creating text output, and then use the JSON stringify. We can actually set this up within a separate variable, and we'll just call it output. And then using the JSON stringify method, we're going to stringify the object data. So it's going to return it back within a string format, and we need that in order to output it. And then also within the content service, let's go ahead and we're going to set the meme type. And the meme type that we're setting is going to be the JSON meme type. So using the content service once again, set the meme type, and the meme type output is going to be JSON. So that way any connection to this web page will see that this is JSON output, and it'll be able to make use of the JSON output. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to deploy the web app. So going in the top right hand side under the deploy button, select a new deployment. Under the type, select web app, enter in a description. I'm just going to set it to only be able to access by myself. If you are having an open API, you will need to set it to anyone in order to be able to access it. And that will leave it completely open for any connections to request the data from your endpoint. So go ahead and deploy it. And you can either click the URL or select copy and paste it within the browser to open up the web app. And see, once we go with the URL into the web browser, this is going to be the output that we're able to receive. So we want to create a spreadsheet with some data, and then use the data within the spreadsheet and output it within the web application. So we can get rid of the object information, and this is just going to be a function that we can use in order to create the object data, and it's just going to return back the object information here that we have. So that way we can simplify the function. And this is returning back the object. And within the doGet, we've got a variable called object. And we're going to be using the function makeObject. And that's going to return back the object data that then we can use within the script. So that would just cleans up the doGet function and separates out the data from the doGet. And now we can just update the object data and have that update within the output. So we're going to go over to deploy and check the test deployment. And this is the developer version of the deployment. In the test deployment in the developer version, this is where you can make updates to the code, and that's going to instantly update the output content. So if I was to make an update to the ID value and go out to the developer version, it will update in the developer version, but it's not going to update in the live web app launched version. So that's the ID still stayed the same. So use the developer version while you're developing the application, and then once you deploy it live, then this is the endpoint that you would be connecting to with your applications. So now let's go ahead and we're going to get the data. So we'll create a sheet data function, and we want to return back the data from the spreadsheet. And we're going to need to get the two values. So we've got the values where we're using the object, and we need to create it within an object format. So that's getting the sheet data and converting it into an object format. So within the sheet, this is going to be containing a bunch of arrays. So we've got the heading array, and then we also are going to have the array of data that's contained within the rows. I'm going to go ahead and use an existing spreadsheet and open up the sheet, select the ID of the spreadsheet, and I'm going to use this sheet as the source to output the data within the web app. Get the ID from the sheet and then paste it into the web application so that you can reference the sheet ID. And now let's go ahead and we're going to get the data that's contained within the spreadsheet. So we want to first select the sheet object, and we can use the spreadsheet app service and then open the sheet by ID, since we do have the ID of the spreadsheet that we want to use. So that's going to be selecting the actual sheet that we want to use. And within the sheet, within the spreadsheet, we want to actually select the sheet that we want to get the data from. Potentially within the spreadsheet, there's more than one sheets. So using the spreadsheet object, and then we can get sheet by name, or we can just use the get sheets and return back all of the sheets, and we can select the first sheet if we wanted to. So in this case, we do have a sheet. I'm going to give it a name of data, and that way we can reference it within the script. So we're going to get sheet by name data, and just within the logger, you can always check to make sure that you've got the sheet object properly, and by logging it out and running the function where we've got the sheet data. So once you do have the sheet object, then you can continue with selecting the sheet contents. So let's get the rows of data that's contained within the sheet, and we can do that once we've got the sheet. If we want to select all of the data that's within the sheet, assign it to a variable called data, and this is where we can use the sheet object. And in order to return back all of the contents as data, we need to select a range that we want to use, and the entire range of content for the sheet is contained within the data range. So we'll select all of the data range, and then in order to get the values from the sheets, we can use the get values method, and that's going to return back the data from the spreadsheet within an array format. So run that, and you can see now we've got all of the data. So first row where we've got the headings, we need to separate that out. And then we've got the following rows of content, and this is where all of the content is being held. So let's separate out, and we're going to get the headings into a separate array. And we can use the data and return back the first row of data for the headings. So that'll give us an array just for the heading values. And then we want to separate out the headings and get all of the rows of data. So create an object called rows, and this is where we're going to use the data, and we can use the slice method and slice the set of rows that we want to use. So this is going to be essentially all of the rows of data and separating out the headings from the data. You can also run that within the logger, and now we see we just have the data, so it's removed out that first row that was contained there. And we want to convert this into a usable object. So let's create a function in order to manage that, where we can take the object rows and headings and construct an object out of it. So this is just going to be a quick function that's going to allow us to make an object. We're going to require the data. And to keep things simple, I'll call this rows, and then the rest of that's where all of the content is going to be held, and then the headings for the data. And this is going to return back a value. And for now, we're just going to log it into the log. So just as we were doing before. So we want to return back using the rows and the map method. And within the function, let's map out each row value. And within those rows, in order to construct the temporary object data, we'll have an object there. And then looping through each one of the headings. So this is again the first row of data that we had within the spreadsheet. It will loop through each one of those, and it'll get a heading and an index value. And this is just the regular typical for each loop where we can get the heading values. And then from here, we want to add it into the temporary object using whatever we have for the heading, and then set the row using the index value. So for assigning a value to the temporary row. And then for the map, we're going to be returning back that temporary object that was just created. So let's see how this looks. Once again, run the sheet data. And this is outputting the values as an object. So we've got first, country, email, last. And as we're looping through the headings, I'm going to reset the heading value to be using the lowercase. So convert it to lowercase. And this is just a function that you can use in order to convert the data values, so the property names, to lowercase. And then also, in case we have some spaces there, we can do a replace using a regular expression, just as we would with JavaScript. So we use the replace method in order to replace any of the white space, and that's just globally. So returning back and removing all of the white space. Remove all of that out of the headings. So this is in case any of the headings are structured, if we have the first user and last user. So we've got some spaces in there. And now when we run the sheet data, this should join those together and lowercase them. So that way it's a little bit easier to read as the object information, and it's going to be more consistent that they're all lowercase. So now that we've created the rows and the headings values, then we can send those in and output them using the do content, and simply return back the results that we've got from the make object. And instead of using the constructed data that we had here, now we've got a new data object that we can use as we're outputting into the do get. So let's do a quick update of that, and then go out to the web page where we've got the do get. And this is now outputting the data from the spreadsheet as real-time directly within the web page. And that means that if you make any updates to the content within the sheet, and once you refresh the endpoint, that data is now going to be updated to reflect that JSON data. So this is going to be usable JSON data, and this is how you can create an endpoint for your web application to output data from your spreadsheet. So it'll simply output all of the data that you have within one particular sheet and construct it as an object, and then output it within a JSON format within the web app. So once you've completed and made the updates and you're ready to deploy the actual real application, so the developer version is working as expected, we can go back to the deployment, hit the new deployment, and call it the ready API, and select it to anyone to be able to connect to it, and then do a deploy of the web application. Copy the URL, paste the URL within the browser just to make sure everything is working properly, and you're getting the output as expected. And now you can use that as a connection to an endpoint. I'm going to create, got a web editor opened over here, and we can do the output as a class, and then connecting to the script file, and that's going to be app.js. And within the script file, create a variable called for the ID, or that's going to be the endpoint URL. And we can make a fetch request to get the data from the endpoint. I'm going to launch this web app into the browser window, open up the developer tools console, and then go back into the HTML. We'll just right click in there, and we'll select that element within the JavaScript using the document object and query selector, selecting the element with a class of output. And then we can add the event to it. We can add the on-click event to it. So whenever it gets clicked, it can run the anonymous function that will make the fetch request. to the URL, return back the data. And since this is going to be as JSON, we can use the JSON method. And then for now, we'll take the data that's being returned back and we'll log it into the console using the console log. So save that. And now when we click it, it makes the request, returns back the data from the spreadsheet. And that's coming from the endpoint that we just created. Of course, once we have the data, then we can use that to output onto the page. Let's create a main container object using the document create element, the element that we're creating. And this is going to be a main div that we can use in order to add the data in as we loop through the data and we add the data content. And the main, we can append that to the output area. So let's take the output and append the main object to the output element. And as we loop through, we'll create a div that will get the contents of each one of the elements that we're creating. And so this one can also be a div, and then adding in within the div. So we can set the inner HTML of the div as we're creating it. I'm using the backticks, so the template literals, so that way we can select the data contents. And as we're looping through the data, and it's actually probably better to create a separate function. And I'll just call this maker. It's going to take in the data contents, and then we're going to loop through the data contents within the maker function. So this is just going to be sending the data that's being returned back into the maker function. And then within the maker function, we're creating the main parent HTML that we're going to be appending it to. We can add that as well within the main maker. And then as we take the data and loop through for each one of the data, that's going to return back user information that then we can use in order to construct the page element. And we're going to be adding that into the main object. So select main, and we can append the newly created div into the main element, and selecting out the content from the user. So we've got a user email, we've got the user first, last, and country. So all of that information is contained within the content that's coming back from the sheet, and that's also user last. And this way you could use, as long as you've got the property names from the sheet headings, then you can select it and output those objects into your web page. So now when we click it, it's going to make a request to the spreadsheet and output the data from the spreadsheet onto the page. And if there are any changes to the spreadsheet data, so if we change them all to Canada, we go back out to the page, we make a request. Now it's going to be reflected that these are the new changes as we're making the clicks on the web page. And that's reflecting the new changes within the spreadsheet. So that's how you can use the Google Apps script in order to create an endpoint and then connect to it using JavaScript.